Hello, everybody, and welcome to this week's episode of Roundhouse Crosstalk, a podcast hosted by the California State Railroad Museum. Something we've encountered a lot in this podcast is looking at the railroad as a part of modernity, something that showcases the power of the modern world, especially in the early modern period. And in this week's episode, we're going to look about one of the first modern wars, or arguably the first modern era war. That's what our interviewee argues here today. We're going to be talking about the Crimean War. So something we don't really talk that much about here at state parks all that often, obviously, something that took place far across our shores, not involved in California directly, but what it does do is show the power of the railroads and how it impacted things in different areas across the globe. So for this interview, I'm going to interview Anthony Dawson, who wrote a book on the Crimean War, and specifically on the railroad's involvement. I think it went really well. Anthony was a great interviewee to have on our program. So I hope you guys enjoy, and I'll see you guys in a little bit. I'd like to welcome you to Roundhouse Crosstalk, and thank you for coming on our podcast today to talk about the railroad's involvement in the Crimean War. And maybe we can just start with some of the basics of the Crimean War, since that's maybe not something that all of our listeners are super familiar with. So let's just start with the very basics here. Who was the war between and what was the dispute about?
Well, firstly, thank you for inviting me on your podcast. Really excited to do this. The Crimean War was fought between 1853 and 1856 by the unlikely alliance of the Ottoman Empire, which we might call today Turkey, Great Britain, Napoleonic France, and the little teeny tiny independent kingdom of Piedmont, Sardinia, against Tsarist Russia. It was fought over the seemingly ludicrous issue over who should have the keys to the holy places in Jerusalem, whether it should be the Roman Catholics or whether it should be the Orthodox Church. Traditionally, since the Crusades, the French and the French Catholics had held the keys to the holy places, but during the French Revolution, that had been allowed to lapse. And the Russian Orthodox had taken on the mantle of looking after the keys to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre and places like that. And then the Emperor Napoleon III came on the scene, and he said, actually, I think you'll find it's a traditional French duty to look after the holy places. And he had a star, a silver star engraved with the arms of France, put over the site of the manger of Jesus in Bethlehem, which caused international outrage. We think of something like that being quite small and petty, but it was a major act, a major political act, with France saying, hello, you thought we were off the international political stage after 1815. We're back, and we've got a Napoleon. So the Russians were outraged, the Orthodox Church was outraged, and Russia invaded what is now modern-day Romania, which was back in 1853 part of the Ottoman Empire. And the Tsar of Russia said, right, it's about time we settle this dispute over who has the keys to the holy places, over who controls the Eastern Mediterranean and who controls what is now Constantinople. And Britain and France looked on askance, saying to Russia, no, you can't possibly do all this. And they went to war in February 1854 against Russia on behalf of Turkey to prop up the Ottoman Empire, which was falling to pieces, but it would stagger on until 1914, so another 60 odd years of it, to basically stop the Russian military juggernaut stomping west, capturing Constantinople and taking control of the Eastern Mediterranean, which at that point was thought to be a French lake, as it were, and it it was fought on a global scale, not just in the Crimea, but in the Baltic and even in the Pacific.
Gotcha. And it's sort of interesting. So this war starts because of primarily these religious and traditional roles,
Yeah.
which sounds, at least to me, almost like something out of you'd expect it more in the 1600s, maybe 1700s, and earlier. However, when we talk about the technology actually used to fight the war, you refer to it as the first modern war. So what goes into making the Crimean War the first modern war?
It's a combination of the scale of the war and the technologies used. The French army mobilized over 1 million men, which at that point was a unprecedented mobilization of an army. The last time something like that had happened had been back in 1812, when Napoleon I had decided to have a go at Russia, and we know how that turned out. But it was the first truly industrial war, because you had railways, you had the steam engines powering not just railways but factories. So you had mass production on an industrial scale for the first time. You had steamships as well, which could go further and faster than wooden sailing ships. You had the first ironclad battleships. And suddenly, Nelson's Navy, the wooden walls firing cannonballs at each other, they're completely obsolete. You've now got shell guns firing explosive shells, as we'd understand it. You've also got other modern weapons. It's the first time you have the mass use of rifles and rifled muskets. We think of the American Civil War as being perhaps the first modern war, but the Crimean War 10 years earlier got the first use of rifled muskets, and the British Army using the Enfield rifle, which used in the American Civil War, the French using the Minier rifle, Claude Etienne Minier. How much more French can you get? With his rifle, got rifled artillery. You have the use of the electric telegraph, both using Morse code, and visual telegraphs by a chap called Chappé. And other things like you've got the use of typewriters and carbon paper. So instead of having staff officers having to copy out orders by hand, it's tappy, tappy, tap, tap, typing away in a typewriter, which means that you can transmit orders from generals to the soldiers far more easily. And you're not having to try and decipher someone's handwritten scroll written on their lap at 2 o'clock in the morning saying we must march. So yeah, it's from the size of it, the technology, and the new weapons.
So obviously, with these considerably bigger armies, one of the things that we see in this war is a bigger need to have professionalized supply lines, making sure that you can actually equip all of these people and make sure that they have rations and bullets for those new weapons technologies and all these other things. So one thing your book does is look at the starting point that these different countries have, specifically comparing Britain as well as France. So can you give us a little bit of a backstory here? Are they both perfectly fine? There's no problems. Is one country better than the other one at supplying their soldiers at the beginning of the war? What's going on here?
Well, for the British Army, it didn't really have a logistical support network. Britain still doesn't have a standing army. It's voted into existence every year. And the British Army was basically run on the cheap. And because in Britain, ever since the days of Oliver Cromwell, there's been this fear of having a standing army. And things like the commissariat, which supplied all the rations and the pay to the army, wasn't actually part of the army at all. It was part of the civilian government, it was part of the treasury. The part of the army that supplied the weapons, ammunition, and winter greatcoats and things like the tents and camp equipage was part of the Honourable and Ancient Board of Ordnance. That goes back to something like 1485 or something stupid. But that actually wasn't part of the British Army either. And the hospital service wasn't part of the British Army. So you had all these different, effectively civilian organisations trying to supply the British Army. And it worked in peacetime, but it couldn't possibly work in wartime because you got too many different sets of people trying to control it. The other problem was that organisations like the Commissariat, the whole British Army during peacetime was run down to a bare skeleton. So when war was declared, the army was rapidly brought up to strength, and things like the Commissariat was brought up to strength from a couple of geriatrics for the Crimean War, about 50 officers to supply an army of 25,000 men. And the head of the Commissariat was over 65. The British Commander-in-Chief, Lord Raglan, was over 65. And out of all the different officers who could have had the job, he was the only one who was under 70. And he'd last fought at the Battle of Waterloo in 1815 and had never commanded an army in the field. He'd sat behind a desk for 40 years. The other problem was that they literally had no means of getting food, rations, uniforms, tents to the troops. They had no wagon train. They had nothing like that because they disbanded it 20 years earlier because it was too expensive. So the British Army somehow muddled all of this together, started all these organizations from scratch, and struggled to put 25,000 men in the field. The French army, thanks to Napoleon I, it had a commissariat, which was a fixed military organization as part of the army. So that was already supplying the army. It didn't have this, oh gosh, we've been mobilized, we need to get to war, everybody. The French army, again, thanks to Napoleon, it had a wagon train called the Train des Équipages, which could move all its stores. It had a specialist artillery train to move all the artillery and the siege guns and the ammunition. It had an ambulance service with ambulances to evacuate soldiers from the battlefield. And another crucial thing that the British didn't have was the British Army, its uniforms were supplied by outside contractors. And they supplied uniforms once a year on the 1st of April. And the whole system was geared up to supply one uniform per man once a year. That's absolutely fine in peacetime. As soon as you go to war and you suddenly need to issue new uniforms or replacement uniforms, you literally don't have them. Yeah. The French army had magazines full of thousands of pairs of trousers, shakots, boots, haversacks, you name it, because they had something called Ateliers Nationaux, or national workshops, which was a job creation scheme for the very poor who sat around making army uniforms. So the French army didn't have a problem when it came to supplies because it just had thousands of them in store. The same with the Russians. They had everything to hand, but they had to transport things over immensely different distances to actually get it from Moscow or St. Petersburg into Crimea.
So now that the stage is kind of set here, we see the British having some problems getting their supplies to their people and making sure that there's enough supplies to go around. But because we're a railroad podcast here, we definitely want to focus a little bit on the railroad's impact on all of this as well. So maybe to lead us into that, can you tell us a little bit about that very first winter and some of the problems they faced there that led them to want to build a railroad?
Allies had assumed that there wouldn't be a winter campaign. They thought they would capture Sevastopol in a couple of weeks and they would spend winter in the city. they'd have no need to prepare for a winter campaign. They wouldn't need tents, greatcoats, heavy-duty clothing, things like that. The other problem the British had was that they had their main supply base at a little tiny harbour called Balaclava, which is where we get the balaclava helmet from, because that was knitted, pattern designed and knitted to keep soldiers' faces warm in the Crimea, with just your nose and your mouth sticking out. And there wasn't a proper road from the port of Balaclava to the British camp up on the heights overlooking Sevastopol. And remembering that they didn't have any form of military train, no military transport, they assumed that the local Russian peasants would be so overjoyed to see them that they could hire or loan their horses and carts. Suffice to say, the local population weren't overjoyed to see them, and they couldn't hire their horses and carts. So they had to use the cavalry horses to carry all the rations, all the ammunition up from Balaclava to the heights, which was fine in good weather because you're dealing with the dirt, literally dirt tracks. As soon as it became November, as soon as it started to get wet and started to snow and freeze, the road became an impassable quagmire, and they just couldn't get supplies up from Balaclava. They got to the point where they were having to send soldiers down to carry cannonballs in their hands up to the heights where the British camp was to serve the siege artillery. Absolutely desperate. And by January of 1855, they'd lost something like 75% of all their horses. They couldn't move the supplies. The soldiers at the front were starving. They hadn't got winter clothing because that had all gone down in a storm in November. They'd sent out all this warm clothing on a steamship, and that had been sunk. They couldn't replace the losses of clothing. So you've just got to imagine these British soldiers in their ragged red coats, leaky boots, bell tents, supposedly that were 50 years old from the time of the Duke of Wellington, in temperatures down to minus 15 degrees centigrade. So what's that in Fahrenheit? What, about 0 Fahrenheit? I don't know how it works, but it's very cold.
Yeah.
You wouldn't want to be camping in Russia in foot-deep snow, but that is the situation the British Army found themselves. And that's why they had to have a radical intervention to be able to get their supplies up from their HQ at Balaclava up to their trenches around Sevastopol.
So they decide that they really need a railroad in this area. What does that construction process look like? You said that they weren't able to hire these horses and things like that to help move their stuff. Was it easier to hire laborers? Did they just use soldiers? How did that work?
They recruited British railway navvies. They recruited something like 500 navvies in Britain. In fact, the railway itself was built by a private company, nothing to do with the army. It was the idea of then the richest man in England, Sir Samuel Morton Peto, and he'd made his money building railways as a civil engineering contractor. And he recruited 500 navvies in London at his own personal expense. He said to Lord Raglan, the British Commander-in-Chief, he would build 7 miles of railway in 7 weeks at his own personal cost. And once it was finished, he would then present it to the army saying, right, this is yours now. You can do what you want with it. So they hired all these civilian navvies in London and they shipped them out on steamships to the Crimea.
That's interesting. So it was this one guy. What do we know why? Was it just national pride? Was he invested in the French having the keys to Jerusalem? What was his motivation here?
A combination of national pride, because Britain wasn't coming out of the war at all well at this point. There'd been 3 pitched battles: the Battle of the Alma, which was a resounding success for the Allies. Then there was the Battle of Balaclava, which is best known for the charge of the Light Brigade, where the British cavalry got it badly wrong and thought, tally ho, boys, we'll charge this battery of Russian artillery, and got smeared. And then the Battle of Inkerman, which was sort of, both sides claim it's a victory. But all these letters home from the soldiers and the newspapermen, because there was no censorship at this point. The newspaper reporters, like William Howard Russell of the Times newspaper, had unfettered access to the soldiers and to all the officers. But that also meant, and he was able to send back his copy, thanks to the electric telegraph, to London, where it'd be set in print. So what he was writing about at the start of the week would say be in the newspaper by Friday. But that also meant the Russians could read it as well. So Britain wasn't looking good, shall we say. But Peter was also part of a reform movement. Because by the middle of the 19th century, there'd been the Reform Parliament of 1832, which had got rid of things like rotten boroughs, where someone like the city of Manchester had no MP, no representation, but it was still paying tax. Probably sounds familiar. No representation, no taxation without representation. But a little village down the road called Newton-le-Willows had 2 MPs. Doesn't make sense. So the reformed parliament, but the middle class, who were the growing, who in fact were wealthier than many aristocrats, said, we want a vote. Now, we're the men of business. We want a vote. We think the whole country should be reorganized on the lines of business. Peter was part of this movement that saw the army as being tainted by aristocracy. All of the generals were all fine lords, like Lord Cardigan commanding the cavalry, Lord Lucan in the cavalry, Lord Raglan commanding the army, and all the staff officers were all his nephews and his cousins and his hangers-on. It was full of nepotism. So people like Peter said, we're self-made man, we can do it better than all these lords and all these toffs. We'll run the blooming army. We'll show them how to do this. And Isambard Kingdom Brunel, famously quipped, he could have taken Sevastopol in half the time and a quarter of the cost, and Lord Raglan was doing it. So it was all these civil engineers, all these big, wealthy, civilian, self-made Victorian businessmen. Call a spade a bloody spade, I do. Thumbs in the waistcoats, tall hats on, saying, we can do it better than the bloody army, better than the aristocracy. We'll build this blooming railway and we'll show you how to do it. And so they did it.
Yeah, no, and that's really interesting. So it's that national pride, but then it's also like a way to kind of show up the aristocracy and show that, hey, this reformist movement is a good idea. See how much better we're running the army than the actual generals themselves. So it's interesting then. So then they built that railroad. Well, I guess first thing you said they said they could do it in 7 weeks. Were they successful at that?
They were successful at that.
Cool. So once they do get that done, they turn it over to the army. How does the army use it in this war?
It didn't know what to do with it. The army had seen the benefit of railways for about 25 years, particularly in getting troops to the point of embarkation and rushing troops to case of any emergency, because Britain very late on the scene for a police force, so we use soldiers. And in case of any civil unrest, we'd put soldiers in a train and send them to the big industrial cities like Manchester or Birmingham to do police duties. And they didn't quite know what to do with this thing in the Crimea. Initially, it was worked by the navvies and the civil engineers, and the railway was worked by civilians. It was managed by a civilian called James Beattie, and at first it was worked with horses pulling the wagons, and it was maintained by civilian navvies because they refused to work under the army. They said, we're not having anything, we're all civilians, we've come here to build a railway, we're not here to fight. We won't. They were armed, but they weren't soldiers, and there was a lot of controversy of the idea of using civilian auxiliaries as they were as actual soldiers. But the problem was they'd only signed up for 6 months. So they went out in January, and by the time it got around to summer, they were all going home again. So they had to raise another group of civilians called the Army Work Corps to build the thing. But by that point, a new organisation, the British Army, called the Land Transport Corps, had come along. And that was run by a chap called William McMurdo. And he had the task of both trying to organise from scratch a whole new army unit, at the same time as running the railway and providing all the rest of the army transport. He was a workaholic, but it resulted in him having to leave the Crimea, having had basically a nervous breakdown. And things got very much into a mess because he was basically running the entire thing on his own. So what you had was a civilian railway maintained by civilians, but then you had the Land Transport Corps coming in and taking over, providing all the staff to operate the railway, but not to maintain it. And the Army Works Corps, not the Army Works Corps, the Land Transport Corps, again, that was in a weird situation because it was part of the regular armed forces, but it wasn't considered a combat corps. So it was, again, thought of as civilian, not quite civilian, but certainly an auxiliary outfit, not of the same status as the regular infantry, cavalry, and artillery.
Which it sounds like, and that's a new thing for the British Army. It sounds like, rather than, like, as you were mentioning before, in the French Army, they already had these, I forget the name of it, but essentially had official parts of the army that were designed to not fight, but assist it.
Yeah,
whereas that was always the case.
The French Army had its, what were called train formations, transport troops, regular part of the French Army. The British Army had them under the Duke of Wellington, but they were got rid of.
Gotcha.
So it was the first time in 20 odd years that actually had something like this. And again, they weren't welcome, with one very reactionary old general. I don't know if you've heard of the company, but a company called Pickford's, a very famous firm of removals. If you want to move house in Britain, you'd call up someone called Pickford's. They've been around since the 1600s. And they said it would be better off just hiring a civilian firm of house movers to move the army supplies. It's absolutely crackers.
So you said the military doesn't really know what to do with the railroad for a little while. Eventually, I know your book talks about ambulance trains, using them for that purpose. So when does that start, and what is that all about?
It's because the British Army didn't have any ambulances. At the start of the war, someone had the bright idea, and I don't know if you're familiar with them, but there's a group of old soldiers called the Chelsea Pensioners. They're called the inmates of the Royal Hospital at Chelsea, which is like a retirement home for old soldiers. So they're all past retirement age. They're all in the 60s, 70s, and their 80s. So at the start of the Crimean War, someone had the bright idea of let's send out these pensioned off old soldiers as stretcher bearers. Can you imagine it? 70-year-olds carrying stretchers with soldiers on. And let's send them out with some ambulances, bearing in mind there's no horses to pull them and there's a big 4-wheeled heavy carts. Would it be a surprise if we told you it didn't work?
That makes sense.
So the British Army had to ask the French, said, help, could you help move our sick and wounded? And the French said, oh, bien sûr, we have the ambulances. We've had them for 50 years. Napoleon had them. Look, what a wonderful innovation they are. Look, they work. So the French were doing it. And then in April 1855, the British Army said, let's try something different. Let's send the wounded from the heights down to ships at Balaclava by railway. So they were loading up sick and wounded soldiers, some of them on stretchers, into these railway wagons. And it was downhill all the way. So they didn't need any horses, and they had a couple of soldiers on there manning the brakes. And they send off this train of something like 8 or 10 wagons filled with all these wounded soldiers down this hill, 7 miles all the way down the hill to Balaclava. Not the safest form of operation, and there were a few accidents. But the problem was the railway that they'd built up from Balaclava to the British camps was only single track. It had a few passing places, but what it meant when this ambulance train was let off from the top of the hill, running 7 miles all the way down to the bottom, they had to clear the way for it. So all the other traffic on the railway came to a standstill until the ambulance train went past. And they ran it for a month or 6 weeks. And they found that wounded soldiers and sick soldiers were surviving, had a better chance of survival once they got to hospital, because they weren't having to walk down 7 miles from the heights or be carried on the back of a donkey or in a litter or on a stretcher. So it's a brilliant idea. Mm-hmm. But because it upset the rest of the traffic, it was like, we're very sorry, we can no longer run this daily ambulance train, because it's either sending the wounded downhill or it's bringing ammunition and food uphill. So that's why they had to stop it. But by that point, the British Army had bought, had copies made of all the French ambulance equipment, and the organisation, the Land Transport Corps, started carrying the British wounded itself, again using copies of what the French had been doing.
Yeah. So it's kind of that stopgap measure from while they're trying to figure out how those ambulance equipments are being used.
Yeah.
They're able to use the train to get their wounded there.
Gotcha. And it worked really, really well.
Yeah. Okay. So they're using the railroad a little bit to get the sick and wounded down for those 6 weeks or so. But a lot of ammunition's going up, a lot of food's going up, a lot of clothes are going up to keep their army engaged in this fight. So how does that fight go? Do they end up winning the Crimean War? How does that end?
It's really successful. The railway saves the lives of hundreds of horses, because it means that we're no longer having to use cavalry horses to transport everything up to the guns in the trenches. It means you can suddenly transport a heck of a lot more than what a horse could pull up. And by the time of the final assault on Sevastopol on the 8th of September in 1855, the British Army had finally, it only taken nearly 12 months to get their act together, where they had a working ambulance system, where the railway was working absolutely like clockwork in bringing up shot, supply, and ammunition, which meant that the Allies were able to launch their final assault on Sevastopol and actually carry the south side of the city. Unfortunately, they couldn't capture the north side of the city because Sevastopol is divided by a harbour and a natural river, and the south side was divided by a temporary a floating bridge. So the Russians held the key fortress called the Malakoff, fended off the Allies whilst they evacuated the south side. As soon as the Malakoff fell, whoop over that floating bridge, burned the bridge. The Allies had one side of the city, but the Russians were still dug in on the other side, and that's how it remained until peace was declared in the following March.
And then who I guess who got the keys? Did France end up getting the keys to Jerusalem?
The French kept the keys to Jerusalem. Thank you very much.
Gotcha. Okay, so once this war is over, once peace is declared, what happens to this railway?
They sold it. It was sold off to the Turks. And it was repurposed as one of the first railways in Turkey, serving coal mines and a seaport. They had, because they were selling it on the open market, because it's army surplus, why wouldn't you? They'd even received offers for it from Greece and from Russia.
Might as well just keep it there.
Why not? Let's just sell the whole. Let's sell the railway to Russia.
Yeah.
They weren't just selling the railway, but they're selling the railway wagons, the railway locomotives, because in November 1855 they'd got locomotives working this thing instead of horses. So it's a proper working military railway, and the locomotive actually fitted with armor. So it's perhaps the first armored military railway.
Yeah.
And they had the bright idea, oh, well, let's just sell it to the Russians. They've given us the highest bid for this thing. And then Queen Victoria steps in and says, no, we can't possibly do that. Just think of the PR that the Tsar's going to get parading these things through Moscow. So instead, they sell a whole lot to Turkey.
And I'm assuming our friend Peter, who paid for all this, he's not getting that money. It's the army.
The army got the money, yeah.
Army got the money. Yeah. Okay, so what do you think the lasting legacy of this railway and the railroad's involvement maybe in this war is?
It showed the military that the railway could be a weapon. That the railway could win battles. It could win wars. I mean, they'd been using railways before, as I mentioned, at times of mobilization to move troops to the point of embarkation and to carry troops where they were needed. But this is the first time a railway had actually physically been built in a war zone. The first time a railway had been operated by the army, and it showed the army that railways could be built in a war zone, and they were of benefit in being able to transport far more stores and material quicker and in greater bulk than you could by road or by horsepower. So you could concentrate your logistics and you could get a march on your enemy by able to have a mass concentration very quickly of your logistic resources in one location to meet a specific demand or get there before the enemy could. What they did discover was that the railway was very good in the siege, like the battle for Sevastopol was, but it was very hard to take the railway with them for an open battle. Yeah. But it opened the military's eyes to using railway networks at home in times of warfare. So in 1859, France and Piedmont, Sardinia were at war with Austria. a war that Austria, as is Austria's tradition, lost. And the French army was able to move several divisions to get a march on the Austrians by train to win a crucial battle. So they were moving soldiers and material quickly across North Italy to fight the Austrians, get ahead of the Austrians, say, aha, we're here, set piece battle, knock out the Austrians, and then quickly move the soldiers and the material elsewhere, which is what you see a couple of years later in the American Civil War, where you can send everything by train, because a traditional army can only march 15 miles a day. And it has to stop every hour to let horses rest and to let the soldiers rest, check the horses' feet, check the men's feet, get food and drink. Whereas if you're sending everything by rail, it doesn't have to rest. You can send your guns, you can send your horses, your supplies, everything by rail in vast quantities. You can send food in vast quantities, and you can, at the same way, evacuate the wounded and the sick. So think about Sherman's march in the South, massively facilitated by the use of railways. Look at the railways in the American Civil War changing hands and whatever. Or think about the Great Locomotive Chase. Yeah. That railways take a tactical and a strategic importance, both at the moment of mobilization and actually in the combat theatre. And I think the direct descendant of the Crimean Railway is the railways built in the First World War, because again, you've got a largely static front. It's effectively, the Western Front is effectively siege warfare, where you have this network of railways building up behind the lines, because it's somewhere where men can't tread because of the mud, just like in the Crimea. It's where horses can't tread because of the mud, like in the Crimea. But if you can consolidate this mud enough to put a railway on it, because it spreads the weight, you can transport your material, your shot, ammunition, your clothing, your supplies in one direction and wounded in the other, thanks to a railway. And that, I think, is the legacy of what they were doing in the 1850s in the Crimea. And the grandsons of the Crimean veterans were doing the same thing. 60 years later, 1854 to 1914, really.
Yeah, no, and I think that goes back to what you say in the book. It's the first modern war, and you see that through the railroad and its logistics. Yeah. So what do you hope readers take away from your book? And it could be that as well.
It could be that, yeah. It's Crimean War was the first modern war, the first war to use railways, and that the use of railways in war has many advantages and has many disadvantages. Advantage, you can move massive amounts of material from A to B. The problem is it's pretty static. If you want to advance, you have to take the railway with you and build the railway with you, which slows down everything you're doing. You just need more material to do it. And the other lesson from it is that sometimes the railway isn't necessarily the right tool for the job. Because during the Crimean War, the French didn't build a railway. They looked at it and went, no, toujours les roast beef. Only the English would think of doing this, because their army was big enough where they had the soldiers to build proper roads and to maintain proper roads, to use traditional horses and carts. Where because Britain didn't, they had to rely on civilians to do it.
Definitely. And how did you get interested in this subject?
Like my interest in railways, I entirely blame my mother. My mum was a railway enthusiast. My late mum and my father had shares in a particular type of railway locomotive, British railway locomotive called an 8F. It's a big goods engine. And there's a suspicious rumor flying about that when they bought their first home, my father had an eye for it. Did it have a drive big enough to put this thing on? Whether that's true or not, I've no idea. But as they're both pushing up the daisies, I can't ask them. But my mum and my dad were both involved in historical reenactment.
Mm.
And my mum in particular was interested in the role of women in 19th century armies. And because they both did French reenactment, particularly the role of women in Napoleon's armies, and she wrote a thesis on the role of women in the French army. And she was looking particularly at the Crimean War. And the Crimean War was the first war with photographs. So there are all these photographs of all these soldiers, or in the case of all these cantinières in their dresses and skirts and little pretty hats, thinking this is really exciting. This is really interesting because it's a tangible way of understanding the past. It's not portraits, it's not sketches, it's photographs of real people, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no,
And I
mean,
wanted to find out more about these real living people in these photographs and what was it like for them, these ordinary people going through these extraordinary emotions and these extraordinary events, which I think is what history's all about, really, isn't it? It's about finding out about ordinary people doing ordinary and sometimes extraordinary things.
Absolutely. And it is that photograph that really makes it real for a lot of, I know for me, if I can see a photograph of the event or of the thing, I'm going to get a lot more out of that.
Yeah.
Because I'm going to be able to read and know that, oh, this is what these person's actual emotions were while, they were taking this photograph. Whereas, you can get some of that with the portrait, but a lot of it, it's like, okay, they had to sit for this in 8 different sessions. So what emotion were they actually feeling during this thing? So.
And the Crimea was also the first war we've got a real literate ordinary soldier. So you've got all these hundreds of letters home saying, "Mum and Dad, it's horrible." There's no press censorship.
Yeah.
So you've got this immediacy. And when I was doing my master's dissertation, I was going through the personal letters and personal diaries of these mostly soldiers or the ranks, not the officers, reading, getting to know their innermost thoughts. Dear diary, I've done this today. My friend was wounded. The letters are mostly 90% boredom, 10% terror, I'm going to die. But you get to know these people. And the worst one for me is reading. This happened in an archive. Was one set of letters where I was please asked to leave because I was laughing too hard because of what this letter writing describing was absolutely hilarious about the French officers getting the British absolutely drunk because the French drank their wine. British drank wine watered down. The French didn't. And you got the British going drink for drink with the French and having to be taken home in wheelbarrows. But there was just one set of letters from this chap in the cavalry. He'd survived the Battle of Balaclava, was in a hospital with Florence Nightingale. His last letter says he's doing really, really well. And there was a couple of dried pressed flowers in his diary. And it stops. And then you turn on a couple of pages. And then there was this official army telegram to his parents saying, we enclose this diary of your son. We're very sorry to say he died from wounds received at the Battle of Balaclava. Here is diary. Here are some of his personal effects. I'm just bursting into tears because you've got to know this individual through their letters, through his innermost thoughts in his diary. And then, I mean, logically, I know they died in 1855. But at the same time, it was like them dying all over again, like losing losing someone.
Yeah.
That real sense of a tangible sense of history, if that makes sense, of the individual, of that person who experienced all of that and getting to re-experience it with them,
Yeah.
which is it's something you can't get any other way. And it's just like, yeah, but
Yeah, no, that makes sense because you're getting it from their perspective,
yeah,
at this point, instead of just seeing the battle highlights where, you might know what the generals are doing, you might know what they're thinking, but you're not seeing what that means for the individual soldier
yeah.
from their perspective. Well, I want to thank you for coming on the podcast. We'll link the book in the description of our podcast. And I know you have a YouTube channel as well.
I do,
so
yeah.
I want to ask about that. So how did you get started on YouTube and where can people find your work?
It started during lockdown as something to do. Started as a hobby, something to do. This will keep me interested. Oh, I'll do a 10-minute video about Stevenson's rocket. Everyone knows about rocket. Oh, it's been successful. I'm still bored. Let's do something else. And so it snowballed from there, looking at my main interest is early railways from about 1800 to about 1870. When they start burning coal, it's all too modern. So all these basically self-propelled kettles and wheels, but they don't know what it's doing. It might go bang any minute. So started doing that, and it suddenly rocketed from thinking, oh, there's only going to be about a couple of people at all interested in this. So seeing it go from a couple of hundred to several thousand. Now heading to about 7,000 subscribers. Hopefully going to start doing bit more American content next year as well, trying to break the American market. And you can find me on YouTube at Anthony Dawson Historian. My channel is called Rail Story.
Perfect. And we will link that in the description as well. I know I've taken a look at it. Definitely some good things there. Cool. Well, thanks for coming on the podcast. If you're still open to it, I'd love to have you back on at some point, maybe about those early railways in Britain.
I will be absolutely delighted to do that.
Well, thank you all for listening to this week's episode of Roundhouse Crosstalk, a podcast hosted by the California State Railroad Museum. And thank you, Anthony, for coming on the podcast and talking to us and sharing your expertise about the Crimean War. Thanks again for listening, and we'll see you next time.